And I'm sure it's not a fun thing for you to see the party that you belong to for so long in such a sorry state.
That's probably what I would have said a few years ago. Leaving was very, very difficult. But they've had long enough and they simply are showing no signs of recovery, and therefore I have to take a hard-headed view. So tough.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About. And this is the podcast where we talk about religion, politics, and all the places they kind of intersect. This week, it's always a pleasure to be joined by someone like our guest this week, but especially for the second time is an added bonus. So this week we're joined by legendary politician Anne Widdecombe. Anne, thank you so much for joining us again. And I know it's been a while since we spoke, but always a great honor to have you on the show.
No, it's great to be here. Thank you for asking me.
So just to recap for anyone who didn't hear our first conversation, I think it was 2020 or 2019, somewhere around there. We had kind of finished with the Theresa May era and the Brexit, showdown and come through that. I think we were kind of into Boris and COVID era at that point, and I think you had just sort of, hitched yourself to the Brexit party for the first time. So you told us the story of standing on the fjord and deciding to make that leap and call up Nigel Farage. So, a lot has changed since then. So I'm excited to get into that. But before we even get there and get going on that, you mentioned you also had converted to Roman Catholicism a number of years ago. So been an interesting year for that. So what do you make of the new Pope and the new era that we're moving into?
Well, I'm delighted with the new Pope. Francis achieved a lot, but I think that he also got some things wrong, and I think he got, for example, the approach to China wrong. But I was delighted because, there's all the usual stuff in the church. Oh, is it going to be a liberal? Is it going to be a traditionalist?
Right.
And in fact, you've got somebody who can accommodate both ends quite happily. As soon as he appeared on the balcony, dressed in the traditional robe, which Francis, of course, refused,
right.
We all knew that this was somebody who was going to show respect to the traditionalists in the church.
Right.
But at the same time, of course, his background and his ministry has been very much amongst the poor. So there could be no doubt on the liberal wing that this is a man like themselves.
Certainly a mission-minded Pope, it seems like. And I know Francis kind of had some of that as well. But it seems like the popes kind of have to do a little bit of coalition building in their own right, kind of like in politics and, moving into the political scene. I think Brexit kind of built a whole new coalition of voters. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but it seems to me like it was people were voting blue who had never voted blue, and people who maybe voted blue in the past also were voting for the Lib Dems, and it's kind of things were shifting and moving around. So, what were your reflections on kind of the political scene as Boris Johnson left it? Because I think he really kind of shifted some things around, and how do you think that era of the Johnson administration, if you want to call it that, how do you think that changed politics going forward?
Well, I think it was basically Brexit that changed politics, because the implementation of Brexit was a shambles. I mean, first of all, going right back to the time when we voted to leave, the then Prime Minister David Cameron hadn't expected that result, had made no preparations whatever for a leave vote and for what we would do in those circumstances. Then he resigned, and of course his successor, Theresa, just made a complete mess of it. I mean, she hadn't inherited any plans. She didn't make her own plans successfully. And then, of course, Boris came in on a ticket of get Brexit done. And that just reflected what the entire nation thought at that point. Just get the darn thing done.
That's
That was the attitude. It was the attitude amongst both Leavers and Remainers. Just get this sorted. We had years of nonsense. Get it sorted. But unfortunately, he did not get it sorted as comprehensively as he should have done. And we were left in a bit of a mess, and a mess that has made it possible for Keir Starmer to try and rebuild relations with the EU and get closer to them and get sucked into their systems again. And I think, therefore, it was Brexit which suddenly remade alliances. And this was really brought home to me, and I may have said this to you last time, when I went to a working men's club in the north of the country. Now, if I had gone in there a couple of years earlier, as a Tory, I would have been slung out, probably into the nearest pig trough. They wouldn't have had any dealings with me at all. And yet, as soon as I walked through the door, I was cheered to the echo. So Brexit actually caused a lot of realignment. And then Reform, which is the successor to the Brexit Party, I think has done exactly the same thing. People are fed up with both major parties. And so people are voting Reform who would once have voted Conservative and who would once have voted Labour. I don't think we're attracting Lib Dems, but we're attracting plenty from the other two parties. And there has been a complete realignment. And now Reform is massively ahead in the polls, as you probably know. I do mean massively ahead, not just, slightly ahead. And that is the public saying, we have had enough. We're prepared to risk something different because we have had enough.
Well, it's interesting that I think that Labour winning the previous election was, to some people, they felt like that was a protest vote, but you're really getting into bed with the same party that ruined the place in the first place. And I know that the Conservatives didn't exactly leave a good situation, themselves, but it's just interesting that, people, I guess Labour was the protest vote, and then once, they realize that it's really one and the same, you're voting for the same kind of continuation of, the status quo, really, that, I think people have kind of realized, well, we really need a change now, like a real proper change. So yeah, you mentioned about the Working Man's Club, and these are probably people that would have cheered when they heard that Margaret Thatcher passed away. This is the kind of people that ended up voting, really shifting to vote for Boris in a lot of ways, because I guess conservatism meant something different maybe than it does now. Like, it seems like we now have a generation of socially quite conservative people who may, have been left behind by the Labour Party as they move to be extremely socially progressive and economically progressive. So would that be a fair assessment, that Reform kind of speaks to common sense,
I think
social views?
Certainly speak to common sense. Certainly we're very anti-woke, which counts for a lot these days. But I think that when people voted for Boris, there were there were three big factors. One was the promise, let's get Brexit done. That was huge, as I've already said. But I think also he was a character. We hadn't had characters in politics for a very long time. People wanted the charisma. They said, let's try Boris. But of course, the third and very potent factor was that his opposition was Jeremy Corbyn. Now, he was an extreme lefty, and Britain has no record of voting for extreme lefties. We vote soft left quite often, but not for extreme lefties. And so I think there were lots of things that made the arrival of Boris, possible. And he came in with a big majority and everything looked fine. And then just as Labour, who also came in with an even bigger majority.
Right.
Just as Labour did, with that huge majority and therefore the ability to do anything he liked in Parliament, he made a complete pig's ear of it. So has Keir Starmer. Nobody knows what Keir Starmer stands for. And I think this is why Reform is now out in front, as I say. People are saying a plague on both your houses. We want something different.
Right. And what was it in your mind that led to the real collapse of the Conservative Party in terms of the electoral result? What was the defining factor in that, or was it just a combination of a lot of things?
Just unrelieved chaos, and that's what it was. I mean, first of all, we had Theresa May. She had a slender, but nevertheless a clear and workable majority. She then gave that up by calling a general election, which returned a much smaller one. So chaos. Then we had the Boris era, more chaos. And then we had the very brief span of Liz Truss, more chaos.
Right.
Then we had Rishi Sunak, who made no impression at all. And people were just fed up with the chaos, basically. And they wanted change. I don't blame them for being fed up with the chaos, but I think the change that they did choose, which was Labour, was wrong.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Keir Starmer capitalised on the moment and won that landslide. So What did the voters see in him, or do you think it was as simple as a protest vote?
It was massively a protest vote. They were fed up to the back teeth with the Tories. Even loyal Tories were saying, never again. They'd had enough. They stayed at home. They voted for what was then the Brexit Party. And people had just had enough. So I think it was largely a protest vote. But I think people also saw Starmer as harmless. He wasn't Corbyn after all.
Right.
And I think they saw him as a sort of Blairite figure. It was okay, he was safe. Well, of
Yeah.
course, he's been incompetent, and if you cannot be both safe and incompetent.
Yeah, he has a little bit of that bureaucrat sort of vibe about him, where he was a lawyer, I suppose, and the man in the suit, he kind of looked a little more professional, I suppose, than the chaos of the Conservative Party. But here we are, he's in power, and it's been, I suppose, coming up on a year now, if it hasn't already passed a year. So we've had 1 year of Labour. Has anything of substance changed? Have we moved into a new a new defined era of politics, or compare them to the previous Conservative Party? What differences have you noticed?
Well, I don't think the only change really has been the rise of reform. I mean, if you actually look at the two major parties, there isn't very much to point to between them and say, well, this is different. And I think one reason for that is, and I may have mentioned this when we last spoke, it's the quality of parliamentarian, which is extremely low.
Right.
You look round now and you try to look for the big figures of yesteryear, Thatcher on the Conservative side, people like Barbara Castle, Shirley Williams over on the other side, Nigel Lawson, big chancellors like that. You look at them all, Tony Blair even, you look at them all and you say, where are they now? Where are those caliber of people now? And the answer is they're not there. And one reason for that, there are many reasons, but one reason is that both major parties, or indeed so have the Lib Dems, have selected not just on pure merit, but also on quota. You must have so many women, you must have so many ethnics, you must have so many gays, whatever it may be, you must have like this quota. And particularly the women thing has been very strong. And of course, once you do that, I mean, it won't have an immediate effect, but you do that over 25 years, which is what has been going on. And you end up with a parliament that has not largely been selected on merit. And that says it all.
Yes, I seem to remember we mentioned this last time about the whole, I guess it was the A-list, is that what they called it? Or
that was the Tory one.
The Tories, yes. And
the Labour, worse, they had all women shortlists, and that meant effectively that there were constituencies for which even the best qualified men, including local men, couldn't apply.
Well, I think even, people like yourself and Margaret Thatcher and others, they showed that if someone is determined to be in politics, it doesn't matter if they're male or female. They can, if they're of a quality that people will vote for and trust, then it doesn't matter. But now it's you kind of speed the process up for people who are not qualified, like you mentioned, and that's kind of been to the detriment of the quality of parliamentarian. But I think that was evident during Brexit, because it was, I mean, it was a national disgrace, I would say, the way that people in Parliament acted and how they, to me, it was just, the disgrace was that they were elected to represent the will of the people and were quite openly standing against that. So that was, to me, it's, I don't know, even, it's hard to even go back and think about that, because the anger that people felt at the time was that they had put their trust in people who didn't really care at all about actually, representing the people who voted for them. So yes, we're into this kind of new era of politics, I would say, where the two-party system is really starting to show some cracks, if it hasn't already splintered in two completely. So the Brexit Party became obviously the Reform Party. How did they find their identity, or what has the process been to find the identity in a post-Brexit era? Because really the Brexit Party was a single issue. Really, that was, I mean, there was a little more to it, but really it was focused on Brexit. So how has the process been of defining what a third party that could credibly be in government? What's that process been like, and who are you appealing to?
Well, interestingly, when the Brexit Party first morphed into Reform, I didn't join Reform. I was politically homeless for a while, because I thought the Brexit Party had very clearly defined purpose. Everybody knew what it was about.
Hmm.
It wasn't just about getting Brexit, it was maximising Brexit, it was getting Britain competitive, it was setting up in competition with the EU as opposed to following it. And everybody knew what the Brexit Party stood for. And then when it became reform, I was very dubious at first because I said, well, what is reform? What's it about? We know that it's pro-Brexit. We know that it's in favour of the Union and it wants to keep Northern Ireland and all the rest of it. We know all that. But apart from that, what's it about? And I think it took me more than a year to decide that I would actually join reform. I think it was probably about 2 years. And then it suddenly became something quite different. And particularly after Nigel Farage came back, but also before that, we were developing policies under Richard Tice, and we were addressing a whole lot of things. Freedom of speech was a very, very big one. Anti-woke, value for money in government, including, of course, local government. And quite suddenly, we stood for something that was clear and identifiable. And it was at that point that I and several others who had been in the Brexit Party decided, we'd join reform. Meanwhile, of course, we hadn't seen anything in any of the other parties. I mean, the Tories weren't rallying, nothing was happening. So reform, I think, began to assume an identity, which it hadn't had initially because nobody quite knew what it was. And then Nigel returned. Of course, Nigel is extremely charismatic. And even when he blunders, people still find him, credible because they know that he's saying what he thinks. And I think now we do offer something very different. And it's down to us we've got to do two things if we want to make any progress at all towards victory in the next election. And the fact we're at the top of the polls now, doesn't actually guarantee success come the election.
Right.
There are two things we've got to do. The first thing we've got to do is to have an identifiable, highly competent, highly articulate team of spokesmen so that people identify a particular issue with a particular spokesman, for example. So that is crucial because people ask me all the time. They ask me in the street. They ask me all the time, have you got the people?
Right.
So we have to demonstrate that we've got the top team. The second thing we've got to do is to, over time, not by Tuesday afternoon, but over time, develop credible, properly costed, well-researched policy on a whole range of issues. There's no good going into the election, and we wouldn't anyway, but it's no good going into the election just talking about post-Brexit. We've got to have a plan for health, a plan for social care, a plan for education. You say it, we've got to have it. So there are a lot of challenges ahead, but we're meeting them, and we're meeting them with the goodwill of the people.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned about having this kind of, I guess the American term is a bench of people, or like a deep bench of folks that can, be leaders in the party. So people's concerns are that it's a one-man band. Do you think that's the case? Is Nigel just steering the ship, or?
No, he's not a one-man band, but as I have said to him a couple of times, I've said, Nigel, your business is winning for us because that's what you're so good at doing, but you need a huge backup behind you of people who can do all the nitty-gritty stuff, which has got to be done. And yes, I think we can put together what you call a bench of people. It's going to be done by degrees. First of all, they'll start noticing 2 or 3 people, then suddenly they'll be noticing 5 or 6 people. It's got to be done by degrees. But within, I reckon, a year, 18 months, we will have the team that is recognisably the next government, or the next cabinet, rather.
And I've been impressed by Richard Tice and yourself, and Zia Youssef, I think, is also seems to be widely respected as a competent member of the party, and I know his role's kind of changed, and but universally he is recognized as an asset to the party as well. So I think it seems like you're on the way to defining that. But like you said, having a broad range of people with that expertise is a whole other thing. So you mentioned about the identity of the party. So the first issue you brought up was the against woke. How do you understand woke, and how has it taken over society? Because I think it used to be kind of a fringe thing, or almost like it was a people didn't really want to commit to saying that they were anti-woke, but now it seems like the prevailing sentiment is that people are against woke. So how would you as a party define that, and what are you really against?
The general public is against woke. I don't think there's any doubt about that, or the majority of them are. But the institutions are not so against woke, and I think that is a result of what is often referred to as the long march through the institutions. You know, the gradual increase of influence of the left and of the woke and of the politically correct. And that is actually quite the tougher thing to counter. Now, an obvious example of woke has been the whole trans debate. Now, to me, it's a matter of common sense. You know, if you've got a man who says he's a woman, but who's still got his male genitalia, he should not be going into women's changing rooms. I mean, he just should not. It isn't fair on the woman, on the women at all. And similarly, women's refuges, women's prisons, these are not suitable places for men with, you know, all their bits and pieces. Now, to me, that is so much common sense, it doesn't even need reiterating. But believe it or not, there has been the massive fight over this. There's actually a fight over it, and people are saying, you know, that we've had a ruling from our own Supreme Court that says a man's a man and a woman's a woman.
That's right.
Still arguing with this. And indeed, the Prime Minister himself couldn't define a woman when he was challenged. So it's woke is very, very big, and people do not want their children indoctrinated at school. They don't want them told there are umpteen different genders, and you know you can choose out of all of that lot what you want to be. They don't want their children taught that sort of stuff. And they don't want their children indoctrinated, being taught how awful the empire was or something. They want the facts given to the children, and the children taught how to analyse, not what to think. So there is an immense rebellion against woke going on. But as I say, the institutions are still very much imbued with it. And we've had the famous incident recently where a newsreader was required to read out from the auto cue the phrase pregnant people. She read it, stopped, and then said pregnant women, and then carried on.
Right.
And everybody was on her side, you know. Everybody was on her side because it just makes sense. You cannot be a man and pregnant. It's ridiculous. If you're pregnant, you're a woman, by definition.
Well, this may be. It seems like one of these issues that has shifted things a little bit, because it's like people were trying to play along for a while, and then it got to the point where it seems to be untenable, and everyone is now, you know, even the people who played along at first are now like, well, we can't keep up with this. This is just ridiculous. So, I'm assuming the party though is for the usual freedom of expression and freedom to practice religion and freedom to, you know, I'm assuming the party wouldn't be against like gay marriage and issues like that necessarily. Like there'd be for freedom in that regard socially.
Those sorts of issues would always remain issues of conscience, as they always have been, no matter which party's been in power. You know, there are certain things that are issues of conscience: abortion, homosexual law, divorce law, hanging, hunting even. You know, there are certain things that are issues of conscience, and Reform has no plan to take over issues of conscience and make them party policy. To do that would actually be to become the opposite of a party in favour of freedom.
Yeah, well, that's something that I was kind of wondering, because it seems like it's a natural home for conservatives as well as some people who would have traditionally been on the Labour side and the left-wing side. So that's why, you know, I'm wondering, can these different social views coexist within one party, or do you think
they coexist in all parties? In all parties, apart from the Lib Dems, who tend to be much more uniform, but not entirely, much more uniform on these issues than the other parties. And when it comes to those sorts of questions, parties have always produced people of both schools of thought, and always will. And that's as it should be. I mean, when I first went into the House of Commons right back at the end of the 80s, I became immediately involved in a campaign to lower the time limits for abortion. And I was working with Labour people, with some of the Lib Dems indeed, with Tories, working with everybody, because it was a cross-party issue with a cross-party divide. I mean, on the other side, exactly the same thing was happening.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I think Labour, in a lot of ways, they left behind that wing of their party, where the people who had slightly more conservative social views, because I would have thought the average sort of working man and woman would still be grounded in a sense of the family unit on the whole, and traditional, if not religious beliefs, something along those lines of traditional family values. But it seemed like, especially when Corbyn came in, and it was like reinforcing the strong progressive social views and kind of leaving behind the people who were more traditional in that sense. And that's maybe where Boris started to pick up a little bit of steam in the traditional red wall areas.
I think he did. I mean, recently, of course, in our country, we've had the business of abortion being approved up to birth, at will, at the will of the woman, not with any conditions about, what, under what conditions they can have abortions up to birth. That's not defined. It's just the will of the woman, which is an extreme position. It's probably one of the most extreme in the Western world. It's an extreme position. And supposedly progressive, but I can't see anything progressive about killing a child shortly before birth when, a few days later, you would give that child full civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually resist the use of the word progressive. I mean, I would say that one was regressive.
Sure. Exactly. Well, it's definitely a misnomer, at least in our sense. We're both in the Christian faith, so we would certainly see progressive as meaning different in reality to what is actually progressive. But you mentioned about that being an issue of conscience. Does the party have any plans to make I'll have a limit at all, or do you think that will just remain as a conscience issue for all members of the party?
Oh, it will absolutely be a conscience issue, as is assisted dying, as is capital punishment, all the things that are now being discussed in our country. We regard those as conscience issues. But of course, if somebody wants to come along and produce a private member's bill, the government won't stop it. And if enough people voted in favour of something, by which I mean a very clear parliamentary majority, not a slender one, then, obviously the government of the day would have to consider whether to make sure that the time was available to bring the bill to a conclusion. That, is just pretty standard stuff.
Do you think the woke issue is now the defining issue in British politics? Because you would say in the last century it was probably the economic question. So is the social question, is that what is defining the new political spectrum?
I think the economy is always going to be important. The famous phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," is still important. If people feel safe and secure, and they feel their jobs are safe, their mortgages are going to remain low, whatever it may be, they tend to vote for the government in power, for the status quo, because they feel safe. If they don't feel safe, they will look around to see who else there is to vote for. But I think that things like woke and political correctness and freedom of expression, particularly, and liberty of opinion, those things are now playing a role on a scale that they haven't hitherto because they haven't had to. And so I think they will be as important as the economy, but the idea that the economy will become unimportant as an argument, no, that's never going to happen.
Yeah, I struggle to find much of a difference between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party in the last election in real terms.
When you find it, let me know.
Well, it seems like Rachel Reeves being involved in the financial world, and I suppose what big finance and those sorts of things seem like a fairly establishment traditional choice for Chancellor, and I struggle to see how much would change in that regard. But I mean, they're really getting tripped up the minute, Labour. It seems like they're sort of stumbling with every move they make. It's a stumble.
First of all, Rachel Reeves exaggerated her CV. And I think Starmer may, I do not know, but he may have been under the impression that, she held a senior role as an economist with the Bank of England. And that wasn't so. And so I don't think she's the world's greatest expert. And you do need as Chancellor. I mean, I would never, ever have wanted to be Chancellor, because
Mhm.
I think if you're Chancellor, you have to have a very, very natural feel for money. I mean, I think Lawson had that. He understood
Right.
the workings,
For sure.
the macroeconomics. He understood
Mhm.
the workings. I think Lamont understood the workings. Gordon Brown, though I disagree with a lot of what he did, I think he at least understood it. I'm not
Certainly.
convinced that Rachel understands it. I'm
Mm.
really not.
Yeah. Uh, just this is kind of a tangent, but in terms of the Liz Truss era with Kwasi Kwarteng, what did you make of their approach? And because I often wondered, I would never compare her to Thatcher, but I did see something of the, going for something totally different in a different direction, which startled the markets and that kind of thing. But it did seem like a gutsy move to try and shift something so quickly. Was there anything right about that, or could it have
Yes,
worked out?
yeah. I mean, there was, and actually, if you read the papers the very next day, as opposed to 2 days later, if you read them the very next day, the Conservative press were saying, "Oh, this is the first Conservative budget we've had in God knows how long."
Right.
I mean, there was a tendency to welcome it, and I think that she had all the right principles and she was on all the right lines, but, very big but, she made a complete mess of doing it. I mean, she did not prepare the markets. She didn't talk to anybody, such as the Office for Budget Responsibility. She didn't have any preparation ready for when the attacks would come. And above all, of course, she had filled her cabinet, I mean, silly girl, filled her cabinet with all her own supporters.
Right.
There were none there from the other side of the Truss angle. Now, you look at the big Thatcher cabinets, and they had right and left. I mean, they had people like Heseltine and Ken Clarke who were on the left side. Big performers. I mean, Heseltine and Clarke were great secretaries of state. And the point of that is a political one as well as a practical one. And the political one is this: when you're in trouble, if you've got people in the cabinet who depend on you for their positions, they will go and they will talk to the backbenchers of their own ilk who think like they do. She had nobody to do that for her, because the only people sitting around that cabinet table were already acolytes, if you like. They were already, absolutely signed up to her agenda. It was a stupid, stupid thing to do. I mean, any lack of elementary ars politica, that was. And so everything was wrong with the implementation. The theory was fine, though not please altogether, all in one go. You don't do that. You don't go at it like a bull in a china shop. You can flag up what you're going to do. You can say, we intend to reduce the rate of VAT, and then that makes businesses abroad look at us to see if we're attractive and competitive, good place to be. You can say, we're going to do this, but you do things step by step by step.
Right.
You don't do the whole lot at once. Thatcher didn't do the whole lot at once.
No.
We brought down the top rate of tax to 60, and then it came down eventually to 40, but it was done like that. It wasn't just all done in one go.
I didn't know it was even as high as that. I don't think I realized that the tax rate came down to 60%.
The tax rate came down to 60, and then it went from 60 to 40. And everybody said, this is going to cost the Exchequer. Well, it didn't, because the yield from that tax group went up, because suddenly there was no point in tax avoidance schemes. You didn't have to take the money offshore. There was every point in a bit of extra effort and a bit of extra risk. But they did it properly in stages. And that's what Liz Truss couldn't see. She went at the whole thing, just like in a china shop.
Well, that interview, I'm struggling to remember his name, but the MP had came out with to speak to the BBC after the whole shambles that happened in Parliament with the arguing and the crying and the confidence vote. that whole, really the day that defined her leadership, where he came out and said that the people who had put her in or given her voted for her, just to get a position in the cabinet. He was like, I hope you're happy, because this is where we've ended up. You backed her to get this position in the cabinet, but you're going to be out of there in no time. So
I think that's a bit unfair. That sounds to me like pretty sour grapes. People didn't just back her in order to get a position in the cabinet. They backed her because she was actually advocating conservative policies. Low tax is big central conservative policy, which we always pay lip service to, but we haven't had in practice for a long time. And people voted for her because she said she was going to deliver that. And you can't take away from her that she tried to, but she just went about it the wrong way.
do you think the party's finished?
Yes, I do. I understand when Kemi says, look, we're only a year in, and we've got time. And she would say that they've got, they've got at least another year before they have to turn things round. I understand that argument, but things have got to quite a pass when, they are polling in single figures sometimes. And a third party that nobody's heard of until the last few years,
Right.
because it simply wasn't there, is at the top of the polls consistently and by a long margin. And you have to ask, well, what's going to happen? And I think, it's a prediction, I think nothing will happen until the next local elections. And if they go the same way that the last local elections go, then I think there'll be elections from the Tory party, right, left and centre, because people will say it's all over.
Yeah, that was a pretty disastrous result last time, that the last local elections for them.
Well, I was delighted, but it was disastrous for the Tories. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I'm sure it's not a fun thing for you to see the party that you belong to for so long in such a terrible state, although it's, you may think it's for the better in the long run with the new party, but at the same time, it's truly a national tragedy in the sense that an institution like the Conservative Party could be in such a sorry state.
That's probably what I would have said a few years ago. I mean, leaving was very difficult. I've been a Tory for 55 years. Leaving was very, very difficult. And I would have said then, I'm terribly sorry to see the Tories in this state, blah, blah, blah. But they've had long enough, and they simply are showing no signs of recovery. And therefore, I have to take a hard-headed view and say, what is the best chance of getting a non-woke, free, low-tax society? Well, the best chance is reform. So tough on the Conservatives. Tough.
Yeah. And I wonder sometimes if they've grasped the issue at all. But the thing is, when you lose credibility with the public, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get that back. I mean, Labour showed that there's always a way back, I suppose, in the sense of the protest vote or the other party being so bad that people feel like they have no option. But I think the fact that we now do have a credible third party is really a game changer in that regard, because you don't have to choose Labour or Conservative. There is a real third option. Would you say that there's any risk in your mind of the return of Boris, or do you think that ship has sailed?
I think that ship sailed a long time ago. And I don't think it would have the reviving effect for the Tories that some of them seem to think that it would. People will say, well, we've tried this, and it was the most abysmal failure, which it certainly was. So I don't think so. And I'm not worried as to whether Boris wants to try a comeback or not, because I think the future is with reform. And we will keep very steady. If he does come back, we will keep very steady.
So in terms of reform, would you consider them to be a conservative party? Would the party think of themselves as traditionally right-wing? I know people will say far right and all this kind of stuff, but
we're certainly not far right.
Right, it's nonsense.
We are right of centre. But there is such a thing as right with a small r. And I think that people who are coming to us from the Labour Party, and more are now doing so, are right with a small r. That is, they want control of our borders, they want control of immigration, they want crime dealt with and policing, they want rigorous education for their kids because they can't afford private education, so they want good state education. They want an NHS that they feel they can rely on. And those are the things that they want. And, I don't think they care whether that comes from the right, the left, the centre or whatever, as long as that is what the programme is, and that is what our programme is.
Yeah, can people of a traditionally conservative background trust that reform will be conservative economically as well?
Well, we're conservative economically in that we believe in low taxes. And we believe that very strongly. We believe in encouraging competition. We believe in, becoming attractive to inward investors. But we also believe in supporting what Nigel Farage has described as, the low-paid with alarm clocks. The people who work. They don't sit around on benefit, they work. But they don't get very much. And that was what was behind what has been now dubbed the Robin Hood policy, whereby we said we want to get our non-doms back. We've
Right.
had a huge flight of the wealthy since this lot came in. By this lot, I mean Starmer. We've had a huge flight of the wealthy. We want to get back the entrepreneurs. We want to get back the people who come and spend money here and create jobs here. And so we have made an offer, and we've said that if they pay us £250,000, they can come back. They can keep their nom-dom status. They get tax concessions, and we take the money that we raise from that, and we give it through HMRC, we give it to the low-paid workers. Now, people are saying that's a wonderful policy. Yeah, it's going to need refining.
Sure.
There are pitfalls there. It's going to need refining. But as a headline policy, it's an extremely good one, and it combines both of the positions. We're supporting the working man, which is what Labour wants, and we're encouraging the enterprise and initiative and low taxes, which is what the Tories want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in our last conversation, we spoke about how the redistribution of wealth is not necessarily virtuous, especially if you're a Christian. To have the government do your charitable giving on your behalf is no way to do it. But in this sense, I do see something to where it's a voluntary redistribution of wealth, right? In a sense where there is a benefit to the person who is paying the fee, but it's quite clearly being redistributed to those on low incomes. So it's I think this is it seems to me like that it's different to just straight up taxing the rich.
Oh, we will not be anti-wealth. The Reform Party will not be anti-wealth. And our attitude is, wealth is what the country needs, and wealth is what creates jobs, and makes us competitive and brings big business here rather than going off to, say, the Irish Republic or whatever.
Right.
So, we would believe very strongly in that. I have never said that it isn't the business of government to look after the poor. It clearly
Correct.
is.
Yeah.
But it's also the business of government to enable the poor to look after themselves, of which too little is done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's the current Labour government doesn't seem particularly interested in.
It really doesn't know what it's doing. First, it's taking away all the old folks' winter fuel allowances, unless they're on a very, very low level called pension credit. Then it's not going to do that after all, because it didn't prove terribly popular. Now Starmer's own backbenchers have found their strength and their voice, and they're opposing his welfare reforms. Apparently very successfully opposing his welfare reforms. So you don't know which direction they're going in, because Starmer says one thing, the party takes him in another. And meanwhile, of course, it's economically chaotic because, you're not working to a plan.
Yeah, I've heard someone say recently they think it's the worst first year in power of any prime minister, that at least ones that have made it more than a couple of weeks and months. But I think Theresa May, you could make an argument for, certainly but she was in a very different position. But really, the momentum that Labour seemed to have built just disappeared immediately. I don't know whether that was the fuel payment thing or.
It was a protest vote to get Labour in there in the first place. It was an anti-Tory vote.
Yeah.
Okay, so they put Labour in, and then suddenly they were faced with what Labour wanted to do, which they hadn't been warned about in the manifesto. They didn't know it was going to go down this route. So I'm not surprised that people are very, very fed up, and the polls do show this is the worst showing of any incoming prime minister in year one. You expect it in year 4, but not year 1.
So what is the hope for reform in terms of what does the party think Britain can be under reform that it can't be under the other parties?
We can be Singapore on Thames, basically. which is what Europe was so afraid of, what the EU was so afraid of when we were leaving. They thought we were going to set up in competition very close to them, just offshore, that we were going to have a big low tax regime and we were going to attract the businesses and the inward investment. And they were absolutely afraid of that, instead of which, as I say, we never implemented that sort of Brexit. What we did was pretty well shadow the EU. I mean, first thing was to raise the corporation tax. Now, why? We should have been reducing it if we were going to do anything with it, but certainly not raise it to the level of France. So I think we will be seriously competitive, and above all, we will control things. We'll control our own borders, which we're not doing at the moment, our own immigration levels. We'll control our own laws, which Starmer has made a lot of concessions on. We'll control our own fishing, dash it. British waters are for British fishing. And there are lots of things that we will do. We want good trading relations with the rest of the world. And of course, we've already got a big advantage with America, which I think is very important.
Yes.
We could, I say to people when they say, oh, what use is Brexit? I say, well, do you want to be paying the tariffs that the rest of the EU are paying at the moment, and we're not?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a huge future there. But what we do here internally in terms of getting rid of woke, get it right out of our institutions, what we do in terms of freedom of speech so that people really can utter a politically incorrect opinion, as long as it's not deliberately inciting hatred. We can make sure that there's equal justice. We can do those things. And particularly a big one for me is that equality means just that. It means not only that women are equal to men, but that men are also equal to women. That positive discrimination just goes, and we select on merit alone, no matter where it may be, public sector, private sector. Well, private sector can do as it likes, but wherever it may be, we want selection on merit. And that to me is so, so important. And not only selection, we want justice to be equal between the sexes, between sexualities, between races, between whatever it might be. We want equal justice, equal everything. And that does not mean artificial interference.
Mm-hmm. Well, you brought up the inciting hate speech and things like that. I'm sure you've heard about what happened at Glastonbury then in the last few days. Have you? What are your opinions on that and that whole? Because I think that it may be to some people a minor thing, but I think that could be I don't want to say radicalizing, but something that pushes people in the direction of, okay, I've had enough with all of this, and actually can benefit your party in the long run, which is again the opposite of what these people were trying to achieve.
Oh, I think certainly there's a reaction always against that sort of thing when it happens. And, yes, that will benefit reform. And I've no doubt about that. But to my mind, what is more important is balancing always freedom of speech with the responsibilities that come with freedom, which is what you don't do, is incite hatred. And there was a lot of incitement to the hatred of Israel at Glastonbury. Now, I don't necessarily blame, as some people are doing, the BBC, because, if you're filming something live, you film what happens. You're filming live. Now, maybe they should have cut off. There are all sorts of arguments, but they didn't instigate it. Let's be clear about that. Glastonbury's always been a place where you could act and say things that are outrageous, but in the current climate, when the world is a very dangerous place with what's going on in the Middle East, in the current climate, you've got to be more responsible than usual. You can't just say, oh, it's just Glasgow,
Yeah.
Can't do that.
Yeah. And then you mentioned as well about America. So obviously Nigel Farage has a personal friendship with the president. And, I think I'm sure they see politics in similar ways in a lot of ways, because, I think Trump he embodies a lot of the policies that reform kind of is aiming for as well, in terms of listening to the people, listening to those who are, like you said, small r, right wing people who are have common sense values, want to manage money well, want to control borders, all that kind of thing. So would there be a benefit then to reform in terms of that relationship with America, and do they do you think the Trump presidency is quite well aligned with your party?
Oh, I think it's very well aligned with reform. It doesn't mean that we agree with absolutely everything they say. Nigel has occasionally contradicted what Trump and Vance and others have said. He was particularly incensed when Vance insulted the British Army. So we don't agree with absolutely everything that comes out of the States, but the fact is they're on the same lines. What they want freedom of speech. They want to get rid of the woke nonsense. They want to control borders. All those things are, things that we have a mutual view on. And so, yes, and I think the sad thing is that Trump's term of office will be ending just as we're probably taking over government in this country. And so I hope that we do have an American administration with which we can still, because Trump obviously can't have a third go. So American administration with which we can do business. I hope that we do have that.
It seems like it's heading that way anyway. I mean, I'm living in Florida at the minute. I was in Belfast still when we last spoke, but now I'm living in Florida, and I think I don't see any signs that people are ready to go back to Democrats anytime soon. I mean, obviously Florida is quite a conservative part of the country, but even looking at the general sentiment in society and the prevailing, opinions of people, it seems like most people are comfortable enough with where we're at the minute. But the thing that's the big story at the minute, of course, is the Iran strikes in Israel and things like that. So do you think reform would be seeking to get involved in policies conflicts abroad, or trying to sort of stay out of it as much as possible?
Well, obviously we want to stay out of it as much as possible, but there are times when you can't. I mean, if NATO calls, for example, then you have to answer it. That was exactly what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, people still try to portray it as an Anglo-American initiative. I mean, it was nothing of the sort. It was a NATO war. And all NATO countries were out there. Most of them sustained casualties, some of them quite heavy casualties and fatalities. And interestingly, even countries that hadn't joined NATO in 2001, when they did join NATO, they also went out there. So if there is a NATO engagement, reform is not going to say we're staying out of it. We will have a NATO obligation. But what we won't do is just seek to put British boots on the ground of everywhere there's a conflict and a civil war. We won't do that. I mean, we will support Ukraine, for example, but like the rest of NATO, indirectly, not directly.
Mm-hmm. Are you confident going forward in reform's position, or are you still, trying to refrain from being? Because I think the temptation is with the polls at the minute, they're looking very positive for the party. So what's the prevailing sentiment in the party at the minute? Are you guys confident that you can push on and take the next step? Because I think especially with first past the post, I know Nigel has had his opinions on that, but also it could be to your benefit that really a small percentage change in the vote would see huge gains in the parliamentary system. So are you confident going forward that reform will kick on?
Yeah, I'm fairly confident. As I said earlier, the fact that you're top of the polls now doesn't mean that, that is going to be sustained. And I do keep saying to all our supporters, look, this isn't going to be a rose-strewn path to power. There will be difficulties, because there always are for any party. We're not immune from that. But I'm very confident, because I think people want to see a big social change. They really do want the end of woke. They want the end of all that nonsense. And they want common sense. Above all, they want common sense. And every time I make a speech on behalf of reform, I say we're the common sense party. So I am confident. As I say, I know things will go wrong, because they always do, but then they'll go wrong for the other parties as well. It won't be anything unique to us. And the real test will be how we cope with those difficulties when they come. So far, we've done pretty well at coping with difficulties.
Well, it would seem like in the last year there's been, 2 or 3 big stories of the party that have been handled quite well, because I don't think it's dented your ratings with the public.
Carried on. Just kept calm and carried on. As Churchill would say, keep calm and carry on.
Well, for as long as you keep keep representing the people well, I think any party that does that will be rewarded electorally. So At the minute, you're really, in my opinion, the only party that's really trying to represent the public at large. And, I think that it's good that someone is finally doing that, because I think for a while it was really quite bleak for voters, especially in the last election. It was really, two parties that no one really wanted to vote for. And the fact that you were able to gain those 5 or 6 MPs, was it 6 in the end? I think 5. It just showed that there's a possibility that it wouldn't take much to gain some more.
What those 5 MPs demonstrated was, if you vote reform, you get reform. Mm-hmm. I mean, at the previous election, and indeed at the last election, the prevailing argument that I kept coming up against everywhere I went was, well, if we vote for you, we're going to let in whichever party we didn't want. Now, because we've got 5 MPs, because we've won a by-election, because we've had huge success in the local council elections, everybody is now beginning to absorb that actually, if you vote reform, you get reform. You don't get the party you don't want.
Right.
And that is crucial, the absolutely crucial difference which there will be between the next election and the last one.
Right. Well, that would certainly be a valid argument if the last few elections you'd only been gaining 10, 15% of the vote, but it's been neck and neck in a lot of them, with the Conservatives, if not, beating them out, especially in the council elections. So that people have seen that you've got over that point where it's a real possibility. And I think it'll definitely, be a very interesting next election, I think, because I think we're on the precipice of something very different in British politics.
I hope so.
But
it only happens about every 100 years, but 100 years ago, the Labour Party came from nowhere. And now 100 years later, I think that's what we're going to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and I appreciate your time and your, your candor and your views on the whole political system, because, I love drawing on your experience, and because you've seen, from Thatcher right through till now, you've seen so many different shades of the Conservative Party and Labour Party and now Reform. So I really appreciate you joining me on the show, and it's been great talking to you again.
Thank you.
And
time. Yep.
Absolutely. And thank you so much to everyone else who's tuned in and watched this conversation. Thanks for joining us and for listening. And if you have any thoughts and comments, make sure you put them below on YouTube. But unfortunately, that's all for this week. Thanks again, and hope to see you again on another episode of the 2 Things You Shouldn't Talk About.